They had fame, money, and millions of fans. But one thing they couldn't quit was lighting up. Cigarettes weren't just habits. They were Hollywood accessories, burned into legends and whispered behind closed doors. But for every puff, the price grew heavier. Do you know which stars paid with their lives for that smoky image? Stick around, because some of the names on this list will shock you, and one story may even break your heart. Humphrey Bogart. Humphrey Bogart defined cool. With his trench coat, fedora, and that ever-present cigarette, he practically built the template for Hollywood tough guys. On-screen smoking wasn't just part of his image, it was the image. From Casablanca to the Maltese Falcon, a cigarette dangled from his lips in almost every iconic scene. Off-screen, the habit was just as constant. Bogart puffed through pack after pack, the smoke becoming as much a trademark as his gravelly voice. But behind that smooth persona was a man quietly poisoning himself. By the mid-1950s, Bogart was coughing constantly, struggling to eat, and rapidly losing weight. Doctors discovered advanced esophageal cancer, a condition strongly linked to decades of smoking and heavy drinking. The disease spread quickly, leaving the actor unable to perform even basic tasks. Friends like Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn visited him in his final days, shocked at how frail their once indestructible friend had become. Bogart, who once seemed untouchable, died in 1957 at only 57 years old. The cool rebel who always looked in control had finally been consumed by the smoke he carried so effortlessly. His death remains one of Hollywood's most tragic reminders that style sometimes comes at a deadly cost. Nat King Cole. Nat King Cole's voice was pure velvet, a sound so smooth it could melt even the hardest hearts. But that silky tone was built on a dangerous foundation: constant smoking. Cole was rarely without a cigarette. On stage, in recording booths, during interviews, smoke was always part of the picture. His addiction was so intense he once claimed cigarettes actually deepened his voice, giving him that signature sound millions adored. But what seemed like a gift turned into a ticking time bomb. By his early 40s, Cole was already feeling the damage: shortness of breath, fatigue, and nagging chest pain. In 1964, doctors delivered the devastating news: advanced lung cancer. Even then, Cole reportedly carried cigarettes into the hospital, unable to let them go. The world was stunned when, at just 45 years old, one of the greatest vocalists of all time was gone. Songs like Unforgettable and Mona Lisa still play today, but his story remains a chilling example of how even the most extraordinary talent can be cut short by a cigarette. Nat King Cole should have had decades left to perform, but smoke stole his future and silenced his velvet voice forever. Bette Davis. Few stars embodied old Hollywood like Bette Davis. With her sharp eyes, fierce delivery, and commanding presence, she became one of the greatest actresses to ever grace the screen. And right alongside that power was another constant: cigarettes. Davis smoked for decades, often 4 packs a day. In photos, interviews, even film sets, she rarely appeared without one. Davis herself admitted cigarettes gave her that famous raspy voice, a quality directors loved and audiences remembered. But the price for that husky tone came due. She was diagnosed with breast cancer, underwent multiple surgeries, and still struggled with severe lung damage from years of smoking. Her health collapsed in the 1980s, leaving her frail and battling not only cancer, but emphysema. Still, Davis was unapologetic. She once famously quipped, "If you have to be addicted to something, better cigarettes than anything else." But her declining health proved otherwise. When she passed away in 1989 at 81, fans mourned the loss of a true icon. Her story serves as a bitter reminder that even the strongest screen queens can be brought down by something as small as a cigarette. Hollywood may remember her talent, but her ashes came wrapped in smoke. Dean Martin. Dean Martin was smoothness personified. Whether crooning on stage, acting in comedies, or laughing with Frank Sinatra, Martin's charm was effortless. Cigarettes, though, were part of that charm. He smoked heavily for most of his life, and the cool lounge singer image was always framed in a haze of smoke. To audiences, it looked stylish. To his lungs, it was deadly. By the 1980s, Martin was struggling. Years of chain smoking caught up with him, and he was diagnosed with lung cancer. Though he tried to keep his struggles private, those close to him saw the toll it took. His once energetic presence dimmed as he grew weaker. Eventually, the man who seemed to live forever with a glass in one hand and a cigarette in the other ran out of time. Martin passed away in 1995 at 78. For fans, his death marked the end of an era. The Rat Pack magic that once ruled Las Vegas was now just a smoky memory. Dean Martin remains beloved for his humor and charisma, but his downfall is also a lesson. Even the kings of cool aren't immune to the cost of smoking. Burgess Meredith. You may remember Burgess Meredith as Mickey, the grumpy but inspiring trainer in the Rocky films. With his gravelly voice and tough-love attitude, he gave Rocky Balboa the push he needed to rise. But that same raspy voice came from years of smoking. Off camera, Meredith was a lifelong smoker who puffed his way through decades in Hollywood. Though he lived longer than many heavy smokers, Meredith developed emphysema and other smoking-related illnesses that slowed him down. By the time of his later roles, his once booming energy had faded. He still worked, appearing in television and film well into his later years, but his health was a constant battle. Meredith passed away in 1997 at 89, with Alzheimer's listed as his cause of death. But emphysema was a heavy shadow in his final years. It robbed him of the strength and vitality that made him such a commanding presence. Fans remember him as Rocky's mentor and as the Penguin in Batman. But behind those unforgettable roles was a man who paid dearly for a lifetime of smoking. Smoke may not have knocked him out early, but it made his final years far harder than they should have been. Gary Cooper. Gary Cooper was the strong, silent type, the cowboy who didn't need many words to win the scene. From High Noon to Sergeant York, his stoic presence defined American masculinity on screen. And in nearly every photograph off-screen, one thing followed him around like a sidekick: cigarettes. Cooper smoked relentlessly, sometimes 2 or 3 packs a day, his rugged charm paired with that constant haze of tobacco. He was the poster boy for Marlboro-style cool long before the Marlboro Man. But beneath the calm exterior, his body was under siege. In the 1950s, Cooper began suffering from severe abdominal pain. Doctors diagnosed him with prostate cancer that eventually spread to his lungs and bones, a progression almost certainly made worse by his smoking. By the early 1960s, the once unstoppable hero was a shadow of himself. Even then, Cooper remained stoic. Friends said he rarely complained, but the pain was clear. Hollywood honored him with tributes and awards, recognizing his legendary career even as his health crumbled. He passed away in 1961 at just 60 years old. For fans, it was shocking. The man who symbolized strength had been quietly undone by cigarettes. Cooper's death was a reminder that the cowboy image might have looked tough, but his real-life showdown with smoking ended in tragedy. Peter Jennings. Peter Jennings was the face of ABC News for decades, a calm, commanding voice delivering some of the biggest stories of the late 20th century. Viewers trusted him, admired him, and never guessed the truth hiding behind that polished exterior. Jennings had been a lifelong smoker. He picked up the habit as a teenager and carried it into adulthood, puffing through stressful deadlines and long nights in the newsroom. For years, Jennings insisted he could handle it, but by the early 2000s, his health started to fail. In 2005, he shocked the world by announcing on air that he had been diagnosed with lung cancer. Even more stunning was his blunt admission that cigarettes were to blame. "I think I've always known," he told viewers, his voice tinged with regret. Jennings stepped back from his anchor desk to focus on treatment, but the disease advanced rapidly. Just 4 months later, he passed away at 67. Millions mourned the loss of one of the most respected journalists in America, a man whose voice had guided them through wars, elections, and tragedies. His death was a sobering wake-up call. If even the cool-headed Jennings could fall victim to smoking, no one was safe. Johnny Carson reigned over late-night television for 3 decades. With his sly grin, quick wit, and effortless timing, he set the gold standard for talk shows. But while audiences laughed at his monologues, backstage he was living in a constant haze of cigarette smoke. Carson was a heavy smoker for most of his life, going through multiple packs a day. On The Tonight Show set, ashtrays were never far from reach. By the 1970s, Carson's voice was raspier, his laugh punctuated by coughs. He tried to cut back, but the damage was already carved into his lungs. In his later years, he developed emphysema, a slow and suffocating condition directly tied to decades of smoking. Carson largely retreated from public life after retiring in 1992, his once vibrant energy dulled by illness. In 2005, the king of late night passed away at 79, his cause of death officially listed as emphysema. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who made America laugh every night had been quietly undone by cigarettes. Fans still remember his iconic "Here's Johnny" introduction, but behind the curtain it was really smoke that stole the spotlight. Larry King. Larry King was television's marathon interviewer, clocking more than 50,000 interviews over his career. With his suspenders, gravelly voice, and endless curiosity, he was a broadcasting giant. But for decades, he was also a heavy smoker. In fact, King smoked 3 packs a day until his first heart attack in 1987. That near-death scare finally convinced him to quit cigarettes, but the damage was irreversible. Even after quitting, King's health struggles became public. He endured multiple heart attacks, underwent quintuple bypass surgery, and later battled lung cancer. Despite it all, he never stopped working. Viewers admired his resilience, watching him continue to interview world leaders and celebrities even as his body faltered. By 2021, King's health had worsened significantly, and he passed away at 87 due to complications from sepsis and respiratory failure. Though smoking wasn't his only issue, heart disease and age played roles. It was his decades-long addiction that set the stage for his decline. Larry King's story is both inspiring and cautionary. He survived longer than most heavy smokers, but in the end, the shadow of his 3-pack-a-day habit loomed large. His voice may be gone, but his interviews remain an unmatched archive of television history, echoing through a smoky haze he could never quite escape. George Harrison. George Harrison, the quiet Beatle, was known for his gentle spirit and timeless music. But while the world adored his guitar work and soul-searching lyrics, few realized how deep his smoking addiction ran. Harrison smoked heavily for decades, starting as a teenager in Liverpool and carrying the habit through the height of Beatlemania and beyond. By the 1990s, his health was failing. In 1997, he was diagnosed with throat cancer, a direct result of smoking. He underwent surgery and radiation, but the cancer returned with a 8-year vengeance, spreading to his lungs and later to his brain. Harrison sought treatment across the world, from Swiss clinics to American hospitals, but the disease was relentless. Even in his final months, Harrison faced his fate with remarkable calm, focusing on music, family, and spirituality. Friends described him as peaceful, though the struggle was clearly immense. In 2001, he passed away at just 58 years old, surrounded by loved ones. For fans, it was heartbreaking. One of the Beatles, the band that defined a generation, had been stolen by cigarettes. George Harrison's music still soars, but his early death is a haunting reminder that even legends with the world at their feet can be cut down by smoke. Richard Burton. Richard Burton wasn't just an actor, he was a force of nature. With his thunderous voice, Shakespearean gravitas, and larger-than-life presence, Burton could command a scene like few others. And almost always, a cigarette was nearby. Known to chain smoke 5 packs a day, Burton treated cigarettes the way some treat oxygen, necessary, constant, and never questioned. But cigarettes, combined with heavy drinking, pushed his health to the edge. By the late 1970s, his body was crumbling. He was diagnosed with cirrhosis of the liver and high blood pressure, while his lungs carried the scars of decades of smoke. Burton suffered constant pain, and yet he continued smoking right through it all. In 1984, while in Switzerland, the unthinkable happened. The legendary actor collapsed from a cerebral hemorrhage and never regained consciousness. He was only 58 years old. The official cause wasn't listed as smoking alone, but doctors agreed his decades-long habit was a huge factor in the decline of his health. Fans mourned, remembering not just his fiery performances, but also his stormy marriage to Elizabeth Taylor. Together, they were Hollywood's ultimate power couple. their passion matched only by their self-destructive habits. Richard Burton's story is both fascinating and tragic, a reminder that even the strongest voices can be drowned out by smoke. Edward R. Murrow. Edward R. Murrow was the gold standard of American journalism. His radio broadcasts during World War II brought the reality of war into living rooms, and his television reports later helped bring down Senator Joseph McCarthy. His credibility was unmatched, except when it came to his own health. Murrow smoked with legendary intensity, puffing through as many as 3 packs a day. The cigarettes became part of his image. Audiences saw him on TV, cigarette in hand, speaking in his trademark deep tone. Sponsors even leaned into it. He once did commercials for cigarette brands, giving them the stamp of journalistic authority. But the same smoke that gave him his voice was also sealing his fate. In 1964, Murrow was diagnosed with lung cancer. He underwent surgery to remove a lung, but the disease returned aggressively. By 1965, he was bedridden, frail, and struggling to breathe. The man who had stood tall in wartime London, reporting bombs falling around him, was brought down not by enemies but by his own addiction. Murrow died that same year at just 57. The irony was brutal. The man who spoke truth to power couldn't face the truth about cigarettes until it was too late. His death remains one of the most famous and sobering examples of tobacco's deadly toll. Wayne McLaren. Few advertising icons were as powerful as the Marlboro Man. Rugged, fearless, and always with a cigarette between his lips, he symbolized masculine independence. One of the men behind that image was Wayne McLaren, a model and stuntman chosen to embody the cowboy spirit. But off camera, McLaren wasn't just pretending, he smoked heavily for decades. By the 1990s, his body had paid the price. Diagnosed with lung cancer, McLaren spent his final years in and out of hospitals. Unlike many celebrities, though, he chose to turn his illness into a mission. He became an outspoken critic of the tobacco industry, publicly condemning the very ads he had once helped promote. In one of his most famous moments, McLaren appeared in an anti-smoking commercial, gaunt and frail, with oxygen tubes strapped to his nose. "Lying there with tubes in you, you really think about the second-hand smoke," he said. It was a haunting image, the Marlboro Man himself, warning people of the dangers. McLaren passed away in 1992 at just 51 years old. His transformation from cigarette cowboy to anti-smoking advocate remains one of the most striking stories in advertising history. The very face that once sold the illusion of rugged health became the ultimate cautionary tale. Yul Brynner, the bald-headed powerhouse behind The King and I and the 10 Commandments, was as iconic as they come. His deep, commanding voice and intense stare made him unforgettable. But behind that legendary presence was a devastating habit. Brynner smoked for decades, often chain-smoking throughout long film shoots. By the early 1980s, the consequences caught up. Brynner was diagnosed with advanced lung cancer, and though he sought treatments, the disease spread rapidly. He continued working as long as he could, but his once unstoppable energy was fading. In 1985, he gave his final performance on Broadway, and then quietly retreated from public life. What made Brynner's story unforgettable was what came next. Before his death, he filmed a powerful public service announcement, urging people not to smoke. After he passed in 1985 at 65, the ad aired nationwide. Looking straight into the camera, Brynner's recorded words were chilling. "Now that I'm gone, I tell you, don't smoke. Whatever you do, just don't smoke." It was a haunting farewell from a man who knew the damage firsthand. For fans, Brynner's legacy is a mix of unforgettable performances and that unforgettable warning. His final plea remains one of the most famous anti-smoking messages ever delivered. George Peppard was the epitome of cool in the 1960s. Starring opposite Audrey Hepburn in Breakfast at Tiffany's, he won audiences with his suave charm and good looks. But like many leading men of his generation, he was rarely seen without a cigarette. Smoking was part of his style, both on screen and off, and he indulged heavily for decades. By the 1980s, Peppard's career had shifted to television, with his most famous later role being Hannibal in the A-Team. But behind the success, his health was falling apart. Years of smoking left him with chronic lung problems, and in 1992, He was diagnosed with lung cancer. Unlike many, Peppard tried to fight back. He quit smoking and underwent surgery to remove part of his lung. For a while, it seemed like he might recover, but the damage was too severe. In 1994, just 2 years later, Peppard passed away at the age of 65. Fans were shocked. He had still been active, still working, still embodying that trademark confidence. George Peppard's story shows how cigarettes don't just rob people of health, they rob them of time. A man who seemed to have it all ended far too soon, with smoke as the silent thief. Betty Grable. In the 1940s, no image was more famous than Betty Grable's pinup poster. With her million-dollar legs insured by Lloyd's of London and her sparkling charm on screen, she became the ultimate wartime sweetheart. Soldiers carried her picture in their pockets, and Hollywood banked on her star power. But away from the flash bulbs, Grable was a heavy smoker, puffing through packs daily. Her sultry voice and glamorous aura were partly shaped by the smoke she inhaled, but the cost was steep. By the mid-1960s, Grable's health began to unravel. Years of smoking led to lung cancer, a diagnosis that shocked those who still thought of her as the youthful icon of the war years. Treatment offered little relief, and her once vibrant spirit dimmed rapidly. In 1973, Betty Grable passed away at just 56 years old. For fans, it was devastating. She had seemed timeless, frozen in that iconic pose of optimism and beauty. But cigarettes aged her body faster than the cameras ever could. Today, her story stands as a painful reminder. Even the brightest lights of Hollywood's golden age couldn't outshine the shadow of smoke. Lucille Ryman Carroll. You may not know her name as well as the stars she discovered, but Lucille Ryman Carroll was one of MGM's powerhouse talent scouts. She had an eye for raw charisma and helped shape the careers of Hollywood's brightest faces in the 1930s and 40s. Yet behind her influence in the industry, Carroll was fighting a losing battle with cigarettes. Known as a constant smoker, she rarely appeared in the studio without a cigarette in hand. Her long hours in smoke-filled offices made her addiction nearly invisible. Everyone around her was doing the same. But Carroll's health began to deteriorate in later years. Emphysema and chronic bronchitis left her, gasping for air, a cruel fate for someone who once seemed unstoppable. By the late 1980s, Carroll's condition worsened, and she eventually succumbed to complications from heavy smoking. Though not as famous as the stars she nurtured, her death resonated in Hollywood circles. The woman who built others into legends had lost her own fight to smoke. Her story is often overlooked, but it carries the same warning. Cigarettes don't care if you're in front of the camera or behind it. Steve McQueen. Steve McQueen was the king of cool. With his rugged good looks, rebellious spirit, and unforgettable roles in Bullitt and The Great Escape, he became one of the most bankable stars of the 1960s and 70s. Cigarettes were a big part of his rebel image, always in his hand, always framing his tough guy persona. But McQueen's lifestyle carried a double danger. He smoked heavily and was exposed to asbestos while racing cars and filming stunts. By 1979, McQueen was diagnosed with mesothelioma, a rare and aggressive cancer often linked to asbestos, but worsened by smoking. He sought alternative treatments in Mexico, undergoing controversial procedures in a desperate attempt to buy more time. His fans watched in disbelief as their seemingly indestructible hero grew frail. In 1980, McQueen passed away at just 50 years old. For many, it felt impossible. The man who outran Nazis, police cars, and Hollywood itself had finally been caught. His death is often cited as one of the most tragic cases of a star cut down too young, and smoking was a central part of the damage. The King of Cool left behind a timeless legacy, but his fight with cigarettes and cancer remains a chilling chapter. Clark Gable. Clark Gable was the king of Hollywood, the face of a generation, and the star who gave us Gone with the Wind's most iconic line. His rugged charm and commanding presence made him the ultimate leading man. But just as iconic as his mustache and charisma was his constant smoking. Gable smoked up to 3 packs a day, a habit that seemed inseparable from his persona. On screen, that cigarette only added to his tough guy image. Off screen, it was wrecking his body. Gable developed high blood pressure, clogged arteries, and heart problems, all linked to decades of heavy smoking. In 1960, while filming The Misfits with Marilyn Monroe, Gable pushed himself through physically demanding scenes despite warnings from doctors. Just days after finishing the movie, he collapsed from a massive heart attack. Gable died at 59, leaving fans stunned. The king of Hollywood, the man who seemed untouchable, was undone by cigarettes and a failing heart. His death marked the end of an era in classic film and served as yet another reminder that smoke doesn't care about fame. Clark Gable lived like a legend, but cigarettes wrote the final scene. Mickey Mantle. Mickey Mantle was more than a baseball player. He was a symbol of American sports. Known for his powerful swing and charismatic personality, Mantle was idolized by millions. But away from the ballpark, he carried a destructive duo: alcohol and cigarettes. Mantle smoked heavily throughout his career and long after, often pairing it with nights of hard drinking. The combination wore down his body. Mantle developed liver disease and cirrhosis, but doctors noted that his lungs and heart also showed severe smoking-related damage. In the 1990s, his health declined rapidly. After a liver transplant, he was diagnosed with cancer that had spread aggressively. He admitted openly that his lifestyle, particularly smoking and drinking, had led him there. In 1995, Mantle passed away at just 63 years old. For fans, it was heartbreaking. The man who once seemed invincible at Yankee Stadium was gone too soon. Mantle himself often spoke about his regrets, saying he had been given so many chances in life and wasted too many of them. His story is remembered as both a triumph of athletic talent and a tragedy of personal choices. Cigarettes were one of the cruelest thieves in that story. Gracie Allen. Gracie Allen, half of the legendary Burns and Allen comedy duo, was adored for her quirky timing and quick wit. With George Burns as her straight man, Gracie became a television and radio pioneer. But behind her bubbly charm was a steady stream of cigarette smoke. Like many entertainers of her generation, Gracie smoked heavily, often chain lighting one after the other during rehearsals and long studio days. The stress of constant touring and performing didn't help. Smoking was her comfort, her rhythm between jokes, her way to keep going in a grueling business. But over time, the cigarettes carved their toll into her health. Gracie developed heart disease, her body weakened by years of smoke-damaged circulation. In 1964, at just 62 years old, she suffered a fatal heart attack. Fans were devastated. The woman who made millions laugh was suddenly gone, leaving her husband George to carry on alone for decades afterward. Ironically, George also smoked for years, but eventually quit and lived to be 100. Gracie, however, wasn't so lucky. Her death is remembered not only as the end of one of comedy's greatest acts, but also as another reminder that cigarettes often take the brightest too soon. Alan Carr. Alan Carr lived large. As the flamboyant producer behind Grease, and later the infamous musical flop Can't Stop the Music, Carr was never one to blend into the background. He loved parties, attention, and yes, cigarettes. Wherever Carr went, Hollywood galas, Broadway openings, or private dinners, his cigarette trailed behind him like a signature accessory. For years, Carr lived with a reckless flair, but the indulgence caught up. His constant smoking led to chronic health problems, particularly affecting his lungs. In the 1990s, Carr's health visibly declined. Friends recalled that he struggled to breathe during conversations, pausing often to catch air. The man once known for his exuberance was fading under the weight of his own habits. In 1999, Carr passed away at just 62, reportedly from complications tied to smoking-related illness. Though his legacy is often defined by the massive success of Grease, his personal story became a cautionary tale in Hollywood circles. Cigarettes had been part of his brand of glamour, but in the end, they robbed him of years he should have had. Alan Carr's life was bold, brash, and unforgettable, but his final act was clouded in smoke. Rod Serling. Rod Serling gave the world The Twilight Zone, a series that still defines science fiction and social commentary decades later. With his sharp suits, haunting voice, and eerie monologues, Serling became a TV legend. But there was one thing he couldn't leave behind: cigarettes. He chain-smoked through every script, every rehearsal, and every meeting, sometimes puffing 4 packs a day. The stress of constant deadlines fueled the addiction. Writing, producing, and hosting one of the most ambitious shows on television left Serling restless, and the cigarettes were his constant companion. Viewers saw his confident delivery on screen, but backstage his health was quietly unraveling. By his 40s, here Serling had suffered multiple heart attacks, each one chipping away at his strength. In 1975, at just 50 years old, Serling collapsed once more, this time from a massive heart attack he couldn't survive. Fans were stunned. The man who had guided millions through stories of fate, fear, and the unknown had been undone by something as simple and deadly as smoke. Serling's death robbed the world of decades of potential brilliance. His twilight came too soon, and cigarettes wrote the ending. For a man who explored the strangest corners of imagination, his own fate was a tragic story that needed no twist. Anne Sheridan. Anne Sheridan was nicknamed the Oomph Girl in the 1930s for her sultry screen presence and sparkling wit. She starred in classics like Dodge City and Kings Row, her smoky voice and confident charm making her one of Warner Brothers' brightest leading ladies. But that husky tone didn't come free. It was shaped by a lifelong addiction to cigarettes. Sheridan was rarely photographed without a smoke. She admitted it helped her cope with nerves and the grueling demands of studio life. Over the years, her glamorous image was slowly undermined by failing health. By the 1960s, she was struggling with constant fatigue and weight loss. Doctors diagnosed her with both esophageal and liver cancer, both tied to smoking and drinking. Despite undergoing treatments, Sheridan's health collapsed quickly. In 1967, she passed away at just 51 years old, a shocking loss for fans who still saw her as a vibrant star. Hollywood lost one of its most charismatic talents, and her death was widely seen as another example of cigarettes cutting short a life filled with promise. Anne Sheridan's story is bittersweet, an actress who gave audiences unforgettable performances, only to have smoke write her final credits too soon. Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn was the ultimate swashbuckler, leaping across ships, clashing swords, and stealing hearts in films like Captain Blood and The Adventures of Robin Hood. His devil-may-care persona wasn't just an act, it was his lifestyle. Flynn smoked heavily, drank even more, and lived fast without thought for tomorrow. Cigarettes were as much a part of his image as his flashing smile and quick wit. But the body can only take so much. By his 40s, Flynn's health was collapsing. Years of smoking contributed to heart disease, respiratory issues, and a body that was aging far beyond its years. Friends said he looked 20 years older than his real age. His hard living, fueled by tobacco and alcohol, stripped away the youthful vitality that had once made him Hollywood's most bankable star. In 1959, Flynn's body finally gave out. He died of a heart attack at just 50 years old, leaving fans stunned. For a man who had always seemed larger than life, his death felt like a cruel trick. The swashbuckler who conquered every battle on screen couldn't win his real fight against cigarettes. Errol Flynn remains a legend, but his story is one of Hollywood's starkest warnings. Not even the boldest hero can duel smoke and survive. So there you have it. 25 more stars, icons, and legends who lit up their lives and paid the ultimate price. From glamorous screen sirens to rock idols and even news anchors, cigarettes didn't care about fame. They stole voices, bodies, and years that should have been lived. Which of these shocked you most? Drop your thoughts below, subscribe for more untold Hollywood stories, and remember, sometimes the deadliest co-star isn't on the screen at all.